Some disappearances start loudly. A scream, a struggle. Someone sees something and calls for help right away. But others don't look like that at all. They begin so quietly that no one notices anything is wrong until the silence stretches on for too long. On the night of May 10, 2006, a 19-year-old woman named Jessica O'Grady left her apartment in Omaha, Nebraska. She believed she was heading into a conversation that mattered, one that could change the direction of her life. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't leave instructions. She didn't say goodbye in a way that suggested she wouldn't be back. Because to her, this wasn't an ending. It was a step forward. Jessica was carrying something deeply personal that night. News she had been holding on to, turning over in her mind. She was pregnant, and she planned to tell her boyfriend. It was a moment filled with hope, anxiety, and uncertainty all at once. But Jessica never came home. No one reported hearing her ask for help. No one called 911 on her behalf. There was no public sign that anything had gone wrong. Later, her car would be found parked and locked near her workplace, sitting exactly where it should have been, as if she had just stepped away and planned to return. Her phone stopped responding. Her bank account showed no activity. It was as though her life had suddenly paused. At first, people were confused. Then they grew worried. Friends kept checking their phones, waiting for a reply. Coworkers expected her to show up for shifts she was known for taking seriously. Her family tried to stay calm, telling themselves there had to be an explanation. Maybe she needed time. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe she would come back on her own. But as hours passed and days followed, that hope began to crack. Jessica O'Grady had not chosen to disappear. As investigators started digging deeper, what seemed like a missing persons case began to change into something much more troubling. What they found would point to deception, physical evidence, and a level of violence that raised a question investigators still struggle with today. How does someone vanish when there is so much evidence left behind? This is not just the story of a young woman who went missing. It's a story about trust breaking down behind closed doors, about private decisions with irreversible consequences, and about trying to piece together the truth from what was left unsaid. This is the story of Jessica O'Grady. Jessica O'Grady was just a young woman trying to figure out her life. She was 19 years old, a student at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She worked as a waitress, picking up long shifts, saving what she could, and juggling school, work, and everything that comes with being that age. People who knew her describe her as reliable and kind, someone who followed routines, kept her commitments, and stayed in touch. If Jessica said she'd be somewhere, she showed up. If something changed, she let people know. She lived in Omaha with roommates. She had a cat she cared deeply about. She talked regularly with her family and friends. And like a lot of young adults, she was standing at that in-between point. No longer a kid, not fully settled yet, but clearly moving forward. There were no signs that she wanted to leave her life behind. No plans to take off. No pattern of disappearing. No sudden changes that raised concern. In fact, everything pointed the other way. Jessica was working. She was planning, she was looking ahead. But there was something else going on in her life, something she was carrying quietly, something that would soon change everything. Jessica was pregnant, it was early, and it was private. Only a few people knew. And on the night she disappeared, she was getting ready to share that news with the father of her child, her boyfriend and coworker, Christopher Edwards. The people close to her say she was nervous, but also hopeful. She wasn't expecting that conversation to go badly. She wasn't scared. She believed she was meeting someone she trusted, someone she felt safe with. That detail matters, because when someone goes missing, one of the first questions investigators ask is simple. Would this person choose to walk away from their life? In Jessica's case, the answer was no. She left behind her phone, her money, her job, her relationships, her plans, and a pregnancy she had every reason to protect. Nothing about Jessica O'Grady suggests she left on her own, which means whatever happened to her wasn't a choice she made. And it all started on a Wednesday night, with a short text message, a brief phone call, and the assumption that she'd be home later. She never did. What happened that night would eventually become the backbone of the entire case. Investigators would go over it again and again, breaking it down minute by minute, call by call, trying to understand how someone could disappear so completely and how key details could be missed at first. Wednesday, May 10th, 2006, started off like any other day for Jessica O'Grady. She followed her usual routine. She went to class. She handled her responsibilities. She made plans that were already in motion. Nothing about her behavior stood out. Nothing suggested she believed the night ahead would be different from any other. As the evening went on, Jessica got ready to leave her apartment. She dressed casually. She didn't bring anything extra with her. She didn't set anything up for the next day because she fully expected to be back home later. Before she left, she sent a short text message to a close friend. No shenanigans for Jessica. At the time, it sounded playful, a throwaway line meant to reassure a friend that she wasn't heading into anything wild or unpredictable. But later, investigators would look at that message differently. Not as a joke, but as a clue. It showed intent. Jessica was letting someone she trusted know that this wasn't a long outing, that she wasn't planning to be gone all night, that she expected to come back. Later that evening, Jessica made a phone call to her boyfriend, Christopher Edwards. Phone records would later confirm it was the last call she ever made. What they talked about during that call has never been fully established, but the timing would become a key part of the investigation. After that call, Jessica disappeared from every trackable part of her life. Her phone stopped sending data. No more calls, no texts, no voicemail activity. When midnight came and went, no one immediately panicked. A late night didn't seem unusual for a 19-year-old. At first, her absence didn't feel urgent, but by the next morning, that changed. Jessica didn't show up for work. Something coworkers would later say was completely out of character for her. She didn't call to explain. She didn't respond to messages. As the hours passed, it became clear something was wrong. Friends tried reaching her. Family members called again and again. There was still no response. Not long after, Jessica O'Grady was reported missing. And then came a discovery that shifted the case in a much more serious direction. Her car, a gray Hyundai Accent, was found parked across the street from her workplace. It was locked and undamaged. There were no signs of a struggle inside or around it, no broken glass, no forced entry, nothing to suggest anything violent had happened there. It looked like Jessica had parked, stepped away for a moment, and never came back. Investigators later confirmed that her wallet, phone, and other personal items weren't in the car. Whatever happened to her didn't happen there. The lack of noise around that night quickly became one of the most troubling parts of the case. No one reported seeing Jessica after her final phone call. No security cameras captured her movements. There were no confirmed sightings at all. It was as if she'd moved into a gap, a place where the trail simply stopped. As detectives worked to rebuild the timeline, one detail stood out more and more. Jessica's last known steps led back to one person, and the closer they examined that connection, the more the story started to fall apart. What first looked like a quiet disappearance began to show signs of something much more serious, something that happened behind closed doors, blended into everyday routines, and only came to light through physical evidence. The investigation was about to take a different turn. Early in any missing person case, detectives focus on the basics. Who was the last person to see her? Who did she talk to? Who would notice right away if she didn't show up? In Jessica O'Grady's case, those questions all pointed to the same person. Christopher Edwards. He was her boyfriend, a coworker, someone who was part of her daily life. From the outside, their relationship didn't appear unusual. There were no public arguments, no reports of abuse, nothing that immediately suggested trouble. That's exactly why investigators looked more closely. When police first spoke with Christopher, he seemed cooperative. He confirmed that he'd spoken with Jessica on the phone the night she disappeared. He said the conversation was normal. He told detectives he hadn't seen her afterward and didn't know where she went. At first glance, his story didn't set off alarms. But investigations don't stop at first impressions. Detectives began checking his account against records that don't rely on memory, phone logs, timestamps, receipts, and digital data. And that's when things stopped lining up. Christopher's version of events didn't fully match the phone records. The length of the calls, the timing, the gaps in between. On their own, each difference might have seemed minor. Taken together, they formed a pattern investigators couldn't brush aside. At the same time, detectives were learning more about Christopher's personal life. He wasn't only dating Jessica. Without her knowledge, Christopher was involved with another woman, a woman who had recently given birth to his child. She had been pregnant at the same time Jessica was preparing to share her own news. That changed how investigators viewed the case. This was no longer just about a missing person. It was about motive, two pregnancies, two relationships, one man trying to keep both worlds from colliding. That realization reframed everything, because when Jessica disappeared, she wasn't just heading out for a brief meeting. She was on the verge of revealing something Christopher had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. As the investigation expanded, detectives also paid close attention to Christopher's behavior in the days after Jessica vanished. They noticed how detached he seemed, the lack of urgency, the absence of the kinds of actions often seen when someone's partner suddenly goes missing. Behavior alone doesn't prove guilt, but it can point investigators toward where to look next. And they did. Detectives soon learned that Christopher had been living at his aunt's house, a location that hadn't yet been searched. With the growing list of inconsistencies and unanswered questions, they applied for a warrant. What they found inside that home would change the direction of the case entirely. Because people can lie, records can be misremembered, but physical evidence doesn't rely on explanations. And inside one bedroom, investigators found signs of violence that could not be ignored. When detectives entered the house where Christopher Edwards had been staying, they weren't expecting final answers. They were looking for confirmation. The home belonged to his aunt, a typical house in Omaha. From the outside, it looked ordinary, quiet, nothing appeared out of place. No broken windows, no forced entry, no visible sign that anything serious had happened inside. But investigators knew appearances don't tell the whole story. Their focus quickly shifted to one room in particular, Christopher's bedroom. At first, the room looked almost too neat. The bed was made, the carpet looked freshly vacuumed, the furniture was in place, like nothing had been touched. To someone without training, it could have passed for a bedroom that had just been cleaned up. To investigators, it raised concerns. Once forensic lighting was brought in, that clean appearance fell apart. There was blood throughout the room, not in one single spot, not confined to a corner. It was on the mattress, the bed frame, the headboard, the walls, and the carpet. The patterns showed movement and force, signs of a struggle that moved across the room rather than staying in one place. It was clear someone had tried to cover it up. The mattress had been flipped. Some of the stains had been partially masked using correction fluid and white shoe polish. Receipts and surveillance footage later confirmed those items were purchased the same night Jessica disappeared. But cleaning only goes so far. Forensic analysts documented how much blood was present and where it was found. They didn't need to speculate. The amount alone told them what they needed to know. This was not something someone survives. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Jessica O'Grady, and the evidence didn't stop there. More blood was found in the trunk of Christopher's car. The placement and pattern suggested transport, not a small injury, not an accident. When combined with what was found in the bedroom, the conclusion became unavoidable. Jessica had been seriously injured in that room. Investigators also recovered weapons from the house, including bladed items. Some showed traces of blood. Each one was logged, each one was tested, each one pointed to the same outcome. Jessica hadn't simply gone missing, she had been killed. But one question still had no answer. Where was she? Despite extensive searches, tips from the public, and repeated efforts over the years, Jessica O'Grady's remains were never found. No burial site, no final resting place. Just unanswered space where answers should have been. For prosecutors, that made the case harder. For Jessica's family, it left a wound that never closed. But the law doesn't require a body to prove a homicide. It requires evidence, and evidence doesn't forget. By the time investigators finished processing that bedroom, the case had reached a turning point. This was no longer a missing person investigation. This was a homicide. And with that realization, the focus shifted, away from where Jessica might be and toward who would be held accountable for the fact that she never came home. Once the forensic work was finished, investigators weren't asking what happened anymore. They were asking why. Motive rarely comes down to a single moment. It builds over time, through pressure, fear, and choices made long before anything turns violent. As detectives took a closer look at Christopher Edwards' life, a pattern started to emerge. He was living two separate lives. To Jessica, he was her boyfriend, a co-worker, someone she trusted enough to share news that would affect both of their futures. But there was someone else, another relationship, another child. Just months earlier, Edwards had fathered a baby with another woman, something Jessica didn't know. To everyone around him, those relationships seemed separate, but in reality, they were closing in on each other. Investigators understood what that meant. Jessica's pregnancy wasn't just personal news. It threatened to expose a lie Edwards had been working to keep hidden. It brought responsibility and consequences he could no longer avoid. That pressure mattered, because when investigators look at motive, they pay attention to moments where control starts to slip, when secrets can't be managed anymore. Jessica disappeared at exactly that point. As detectives reviewed Edwards' actions after the night of May 10th, more concerning details came into focus. Surveillance footage showed him buying cleaning supplies shortly after Jessica was last heard from. Receipts backed up the timing. Items later recovered from his residence matched those purchases. This didn't look like a reaction to an accident. It looked deliberate. Investigators also looked closely at how Edwards behaved after Jessica was reported missing, and at what was missing from his response. He didn't organize searches. He didn't publicly ask for help. He didn't show the kind of uncertainty or urgency people often show when someone they love disappears. Behavior alone isn't proof, but paired with the forensic evidence, it added weight to an already serious case. Prosecutors now faced a difficult reality. There was no body, no confession, no eyewitness who saw the crime happen. But there was blood, a large amount of it. There was DNA, there was evidence of cleanup, there were inconsistencies in Edwards' statements, and there was a clear motive tied to deception and the fear of being exposed. It was enough to move the case forward. From a legal standpoint, the case came down to one core argument, that the evidence showed Jessica O'Grady could not have survived what happened in that room, and that Christopher Edwards was the only person with the access, opportunity, and motive to be responsible. It wasn't a simple case, and it wasn't a common one. There was no body, which meant prosecutors would have to rely on forensic evidence to speak where a victim could not. As the investigation moved closer to an arrest, the weight of that decision grew heavier, not just for the legal team, but for a family still waiting for answers they might never fully get. The courtroom was next, and once the case reached that stage, every detail mattered. By early June of 2006, there was no longer any doubt about the direction investigators were heading. The evidence recovered from Christopher Edwards' residence, bloodstains, signs of cleanup, weapons, and DNA, had pushed the case beyond suspicion. Investigators no longer believed they were searching for a missing person. They believed they were dealing with a homicide. On June 6, 2006, Christopher Edwards turned himself in. He was arrested and formally charged with the murder of Jessica O'Grady, along with using a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. For Jessica's family, the arrest brought mixed emotions. There was some relief, knowing investigators believed they had identified the person responsible. There was validation, confirmation that Jessica hadn't simply disappeared. But there was also a painful truth that remained. Jessica's body had still not been found. In cases like this, that absence isn't just emotionally difficult, it creates a real legal challenge. Without remains, prosecutors must prove not only who committed the crime, but that a death actually occurred. They have to show a jury that there is no other reasonable explanation. In preparation for trial, prosecutors rebuilt the case piece by piece using timelines and physical evidence. Forensic experts examined blood volume, pattern distribution, and transfer marks. Their findings were clear. The amount of blood found in Christopher's bedroom was not consistent with survival. The location and spread of the stains pointed to repeated injury, not an accident. The cleanup efforts suggested intent, not panic. Prosecutors would later argue that the evidence showed Jessica was killed in that room, moved afterward, and disposed of in a location that has never been disclosed. The defense took a different approach, aiming straight at the weakest point in the case. There was no body, no eyewitness, no confession. They argued that doubt still existed, that without Jessica's remains, the prosecution couldn't prove she was dead, much less explain how or where her life ended. As pretrial hearings moved forward, what was at stake became clear. This wasn't just a trial about Jessica O'Grady. It was a test of whether forensic evidence could stand on its own, whether a jury could be convinced without the one thing they usually expect to see. The courtroom would become the place where Jessica's final moments were examined, not through her words, but through what was left behind. Once the trial began, every detail mattered. Every stain, every receipt, every inconsistency. and the jury would be asked to answer one question that couldn't be taken back. Had the prosecution proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jessica O'Grady never left that room alive? When the trial of Christopher Edwards opened, the courtroom felt different. There were no graphic photos showing a body, no medical examiner describing remains, no funeral to give the loss a sense of finality. Instead, there was an absence, and it was the prosecution's job to fill that space with evidence, logic, and facts strong enough to speak for someone who no longer could. From the start, jurors were told exactly what kind of case this was. A homicide without a body, a case built on forensic evidence, timelines, and intent, a case asking them to accept a hard truth, that death doesn't require a recovered body to be real. Prosecutors began by talking about Jessica O'Grady as a person, not just a victim. They described her routines, her responsibilities, her relationships, and the future she was working toward. A young woman who didn't walk away from her life. A young woman who had every reason to keep living. Then they moved to the night of May 10th. The timeline was laid out step by step. The last text message, the final phone call, and then the silence. Jurors heard how Jessica's phone activity stopped all at once. Not gradually, not off and on, but completely. How her bank accounts went untouched. How her daily patterns ended without explanation. And then, the forensic evidence took center stage. Experts took the stand to explain what the blood evidence showed, not in emotional terms, but through science. They talked about how much blood was found in Christopher Edwards' bedroom and why that amount was far beyond what someone could survive. They walked the jury through the patterns, explaining how movement, impact, and repeated injury pointed to a violent attack. This wasn't guesswork, it was measurement. It was science. It was biology. Jurors also heard about the attempts to clean the room, how correction fluid and white shoe polish were used to try to hide stains. Receipts and surveillance footage showed Edwards buying those exact items within hours of Jessica's disappearance. On their own, each detail raised questions. Taken together, they told a story that was hard to ignore. The defense focused on what wasn't there. No body, no confession, no eyewitness. They suggested Jessica might have left on her own. They offered alternative explanations for the blood. They argued the state hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that she was dead. But every one of those arguments ran into the same problem. Jessica left everything behind: her phone, her money, her job, and her unborn child. Prosecutors reminded the jury that people who choose to disappear don't erase themselves overnight. They don't stop all activity at once, and they don't vanish without ever being heard from again. As the trial went on, the weight of the evidence became harder to dismiss. This wasn't a case driven by emotion. It was built on facts. When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom grew quiet again. The prosecution told jurors they didn't need to know where Jessica's body was to understand what happened. They only needed to look at the evidence and ask whether there was any reasonable explanation that allowed her to still be alive. The defense urged restraint. They emphasized the seriousness of convicting someone without absolute certainty. Then the case went to the jury. Behind closed doors, 12 people had to decide whether the lack of a body created reasonable doubt or whether the evidence left no other conclusion. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. Every seat was filled, every eye on the foreperson, as they prepared to speak the words that would finally bring some measure of closure to a case that had gripped Omaha for months. Christopher Edwards stood, face unreadable. His fate, once only theoretical, was about to be decided. On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Christopher Edwards, guilty. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Relief, shock, grief, validation. Every emotion collided in that moment. For Jessica's family, it was both relief and heartbreak. Relief that the person responsible had been held accountable. Heartbreak that their daughter, sister, and friend would never come home. Her body was still missing. A stark reminder that justice doesn't always bring the closure we hope for, but it can still hold the guilty responsible. Prosecutors described the verdict as a testament to careful investigation and the power of forensic evidence. They emphasized that even without a body, it is possible to uncover the truth and pursue justice. During sentencing, the judge acknowledged how difficult the case had been. They spoke of the deception, the severity of the crime, and the profound loss suffered by Jessica's loved ones. Ultimately, Edwards was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never have the chance to harm anyone else.